Good evening, everybody. Just to welcome everyone to Ayelet HaShachar. It's a great honor for us to have Dr. Rosmarin with us this evening. Just two announcements before introducing Dr. Rosmarin. After Dr. Rosmarin makes his presentation, there's going to be question and answers that can be presented to Dr. Rosmarin. There's papers on the tables with pens. If someone would like to ask their questions personally, they're welcome to do so. Otherwise, they can write it on the paper and forward it to Dr. Rosmarin in the front, and he'll be able to answer it that way. Also, it's very exciting that Dr. Rosmarin is publishing a HarperCollins book on thriving with anxiety. I think it's coming out in October. And anyone that would like to have a copy of the ebook of this book that Dr. Rosmarin is putting out, there's going to be papers going around. Everyone can just write their details, and we'll be in touch with them regarding the ebook. When putting together the flyer for this evening and the blurb about Dr. Rosmarin, that he's a Harvard professor and director of department in McLean's Hospital, Center for Anxiety, Boston, New York, I'll be honest, when it got to the end of that whole Megillah, as impressive as it was, I felt that it didn't really do justice to who Dr. Rosmarin is. Just over a year ago, I had the opportunity of being in touch with Dr. Rosmarin on quite a regular basis regarding his community in Boston. And thinking about Dr. Rosmarin really reminded me of a Gemara, of a piece of the Talmud that says that before a person adorns somebody else, he's first to make sure that he adorns himself. Which is explained to me that before we educate other people, before we try to influence other people, we must first make sure that we ourselves are being influenced by that lesson, by that principle that we're trying to spread to other people. And of having the opportunity and the privilege of being in proximity to Dr. Rosmarin, hearing his care and concern for his community, I think that it's a very appropriate fulfillment of this Gemara. First, adorn yourself. First, make sure that the teachings that you're trying to spread, you can be a Harvard professor, you can be teaching at the greatest institutions of the world, but it's coming from an educator that's first make sure to educate himself, the character and the midas. I think it tells a lot about the person, tells a lot about the teachings, and it's something that's very exciting for all of us this evening to hear from Dr. Rosmarin. I'd like to call up Dr. Rosmarin to address us.
So now you know that I myself have anxiety. Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here and to be with your wonderful community. So I want to start by telling you a story. And it was at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I panicked, totally panicked. I'll tell you why. There were these early reports of suicidality and depression and anxiety that were spiking and going through the roof. And Center for Anxiety, which is my clinical program, had about 800 active patients at that time. We had to shift to 100% telehealth in a 3-week period. All of my staff had to be onboarded for that. There were concerns about the economy collapsing. And naturally, I became very concerned, like, what is going to be with all of these patients who are under my care and under the care of my staff? So it was amazing. I was blown away by what happened. The patients who were in treatment before the pandemic, who started therapy, I'll tell you even the dates, from January 1st through March 15th, 2020. The pandemic started, at least in the United States, at the end of 2020, right? End of March 2020. Those individuals did not have a spike in anxiety in the end of March, April, or May. In fact, they continued to have improvements. They continued to have a decrease in their anxiety symptoms during those months. The patients who came in for the first time, right, the next group, the next wave, at the end of March, the beginning of April, they were in trouble. They were in real trouble. They too did better over time, the next 3-4 months, than people who weren't in therapy at all. But the patients who previously had anxiety before the pandemic were blessed. they were able to thrive with their symptoms because they knew what to do. They had skills, they had tools, they knew what they were going to do. Other people who had not experienced this before and all of a sudden had the surge and they were unprepared for it, that's when they got into trouble. Okay, so ever since that experience, which was actually quite emotional for me personally, just to see it happening, I've been asking myself this question. What led certain people to struggle with their anxiety and other people to thrive with it? What was really the crux of it? Yes, there were tools and skills that they got with therapy, but what's the main point that differentiates these two individuals? You all know people who struggle with anxiety. You know what anxiety is? Yes, you have anxiety here, I'm sure. Maybe it's not America, but there's certainly what to be anxious about. But you all know people who are super successful and they're also anxious. If I start listing off all the super successful people I know, almost all of them have very significant anxiety. So what's with that? Some people have the same symptoms, they use it, or it's used against them. So I'll tell you my perspective on it, which is really the core of the book. That in general, Western society's approach to dealing with anxiety is to try to get rid of it. That's the default. We want to have, we want to be calm, we want to be happy all the time. When people feel anxious, the natural tendency in our society is reduce the discomfort, don't accept it, don't embrace it, don't lean into it, don't let it happen to you. Do anything you can to choke it off and to stop yourself from feeling that way. So you see this in a number of ways. When people get anxious and it's working against them, they turn to become more insular, they stay home more, they stop calling friends, they can get more depressed, they hide their feelings, instead of using their pain to connect to others by saying like, hey, I'm having a really bad day, can we go out for lunch? Or can we do something, can we learn together, whatever it is. Another thing people are trying to do is to minimize uncertainty. So I'm really nervous about this, but I'm gonna try to, instead of recognizing that we're not in control and uncertainty is part of the human condition, people have this tendency to try to reduce uncertainty in their life. These strategies don't work. Because discomfort, uncertainty, and frankly anxiety are part of life. It's part of the human experience. There's no such thing as feeling happy, calm, and unanxious all the time. That does not occur. And people who try to chase that dream end up in very serious trouble. The more you try to get rid of your anxiety, the more you will struggle. I promise you. So when people avoid their anxiety, as opposed to dealing with it, they end up drained from these futile efforts, they end up more lonely, more isolated, and okay. I'll give you a case example to really sort of put some meat on the bone here. So June 2020, just after the pandemic started, a man named Jim, he calls my office in New York. And he was stuck in the cycle of panic attacks. You know what a panic attack is? A sudden surge of anxiety, very uncomfortable. He's an athletic guy, he's in his late 50s, he's an EMT, so he works, he's driving an ambulance during the day. And his MO, his modus operandi for dealing with anxiety is don't let yourself feel anxious, don't let yourself show that you're anxious. This is a big burly guy driving an ambulance. The last thing he wants to do is show the people on his ambulance or people who he works with that he feels anxious. But he's having panic attacks. So what do you do if you're Jim? He starts to feel anxious, he starts to sweat, and he thinks, oh no, it's happening again, I have to stop it. He starts to breathe to try to stop the sensations. He thinks, I can't tolerate this. He distracts himself, checking his phone. He starts talking to other people about a different topic. He's focusing on anything except for his feelings. He tries to slow his breathing down, and none of this was ever really effective. Sometimes it would stave off a panic attack for 5 or 10 minutes, but eventually it would just catch up with him. And he's so bent on not showing anyone and not letting it get the better of him. And Jim's whole approach, I'll put it this way, panic was not his problem. It was his response to the panic. The fact that he's having panic attacks, some 80% of Americans at some point, I realize not a lot of you are Americans, but which is great. but will have a panic attack at some point during their life. So the problem isn't that he's having panic. The problem, he's having an adrenaline surge. Okay, like that happens to anyone once in a while. The problem was also appearing to be anxious wasn't his problem. Like people sweat sometimes and nobody even notices. I'm a trained professional in this. I deal with this day and night. I've had patients who are panicking in my office and I don't even notice. They're like, "Can't you see?" I'm like, "No, I actually can't. I can't tell that you're panicking." Sometimes they do, but it's not usually the case that people start jumping up and screaming and running out of the room.
Could you describe what a panic attack is?
Sure, a panic attack is a sudden onset of lots of physical symptoms of anxiety. Heart beating rapidly, difficulty breathing, sweating. A lot of people have stomach upset. Some people get dizzy because of the lights, because your pupils are dilating. I'll get into it a little more later, but all of the symptoms happening at once, it happens. I didn't have it was like a quasi-panic attack the other day. Something happened to me in a doctor's office. I wasn't expecting it, and I'm like, "What on earth is this?" I'm like, "Oh, right, I know what that is." Like it's a human thing. Sometimes you have a shot of adrenaline. It goes through your system. It's a natural piece. The issue is when people are like, "Oh no, something's wrong with me. I have to stop this from occurring." When you do that, the adrenaline goes up. Because now you're really effectively anxious about your anxiety. So you've given yourself more of a reason to have that physiological response. I'll get more into that in a minute. But getting back to Jim, his actual panic attacks were not the problem. It was his fear of them that was an issue. And once he learned to completely lose it, he was fine. It was very uncomfortable. He had to be driving an ambulance through the streets of Manhattan and panicking and letting people know about it. But he did it, and that's what got him through it. Okay, the problem is Jim is not the only person. Any guesses as to how many people, at least in the United States, on an annual basis, pre-pandemic, let's be really conservative here, had an anxiety disorder?
Disorder or an attack?
An actual disorder. Like a disorder being that it caused them significant distress or impairment.
70%.
20% is a good guess. 70% is like, I don't know what you think of America. But the answer is actually 20%, 19% of adults in any given year. That's 50 million people. Right? Now, post-pandemic, anxiety has increased between 25 and 50% overall. So it's not quite 70, but it's about half of that. Let's just say my offices have become very busy. Seriously, now we have about 1,000 active patients at any given time in 7 offices. Now, what's really cool here though, if you zoom out globally, anxiety is far less common in middle-income countries and lower-income countries. In fact, it's actually stratified by income. In low-income countries, it's half the amount of anxiety as in middle-income countries, and in middle-income countries, you have half the amount of anxiety as in high-income countries. So the solution to the anxiety problem is give away all your money. Alternatively, oh yeah, by the way, here in Israel, I did some data before I came here because I figured people would ask. The most reliable data I saw was from 2007, and it suggests that what percentage of Israelis have an anxiety disorder? 100%. 100%, that's fine. It's not even close. 7? Not bad. 4%, and actually with a 50% increase, so you actually nailed it. Yeah, you nailed it. 50% increase in the last 2 to 3 years.
What percent?
And in 2007, the data that I have from the Israel Journal of Psychiatry and Related Sciences was 4%, and you have an increase of 50%, that would put you in the 6 to 7 range. So it's a quarter of what it is in the United States. So just let me get this straight. So citizens of countries with stronger economies, better technology, more advanced medical care, and more stable governments, kind of, have more anxiety? Here in Israel, I understand, Modi'in's a lot safer, but day to day there is security threat, a laughably contentious government, very unpredictable, and you're 75% less anxious than your friends and family in the Golden Medina? What is going on? It's very strange. But if you unpack this, what I think is going on is that in the United States or in high-income countries, you have a sense of control and you have a sense of security. So when anything breaches that predictability and that ease and that sense of I know what's going to happen next, you cannot take it. Americans cannot handle being out of control. Right, there are all these checks and balances. I mean, at the beginning of the year of 2023, we had a couple of banks that were going belly up for effectively no reason in retrospect. People become consumed with anxiety as soon as it's like they're unmoored, as soon as you're out of control. Here, it's like people don't assume that things are secure day to day. There's adversity on a day-to-day basis, and it actually makes you, and if you look globally, again, if you have major security threats, indigent poverty, rampant government corruption, and lack of basic infrastructure, you're less likely to have an anxiety problem. So the reason why is because citizens of such countries know that they're not in control, and they're okay with it. They learn to be okay with it. So in the Western societal approach, though, there are these predictions for everything, for literally everything. Financial markets, political elections. I've noticed here, by the way, people don't predict the weather as much. Maybe because you know it's always going to be hot. Fine, I get that. But I think it's more than that. Like in the United States, you have predictions on professional sports outcomes, and people get really upset if it doesn't go the way that ESPN is going to predict on their favorite sports team. And what's interesting, the predictions are almost always wrong. Like AccuWeather rarely gets it correct. So people would prefer to predict the future and be wrong than to admit that they have no clue what's going to happen. It's funny. The core of it is that American culture cannot tolerate uncertainty. We can't feel, the reason why anxiety is so upsetting is because of what's underneath it. It's like, I can't handle it when I don't know what's going to happen next. So what happens as a result of these cultural trends is something very problematic that I see in the field of psychiatry and psychology every day, which is medicalization of normal mood states. That if a person is feeling anxious, depressed, upset, they're having a rough time, for any stretch, even if it's 30 days or so, it's like an immediate Xanax prescription. And I mean that. There's this expectations that people's emotions have to be even keeled all the time. Everything's always going to be, when our minds and moods don't cooperate with the expectation of everything being happy, we say, oh, something must be wrong with me, as opposed to, oh, I'm a human being who has normal fluctuations in my feelings. Like when your mood and comfort are disrupted by normal feeling and by normal change, it's like we can't tolerate it, and the moment we feel anxious, we're reaching for, that's what causes the distress. The fact that we are upset about the fact that we're anxious. Our greatest fear is anxiety itself. That's my point. And because of this, people try to keep up their appearances all the time, right? This unrealistic expectation, not only feeling perfect all the time, but looking perfect all the time, not showing anybody else how you're feeling. I think this is one of the good things that's come out of the pandemic. If you look at, a lot of people came out and started talking openly about their emotions and their fluctuations, their difficulties. In the United States, we had Simone Biles, right, who was a great US athlete, gymnast, and she courageously, decided not to compete because she took a mental health day, at the Olympics. But numerous entertainers and athletes have come out and started talking about their struggles. But a lot of people don't do that yet. They don't feel comfortable speaking about what they're really going through. I have noticed, by the way, since I've been in Israel for now 3 or 4 weeks, another couple weeks left, I've noticed that Israeli culture, even the people who immigrated here, seem to be more comfortable speaking about struggles day to day, which I think is great. I think it's fantastic. and it's very healthy to be able to laugh at yourself as opposed to like, oh no, I have to feel good all the time and look good all the time and then getting upset about it. That's not a very helpful thing. Another piece though is it's so critical to be able to speak to someone if you are feeling anxious. This is one of the most important strategies that you can possibly use, as opposed to the isolation, alone, not talking to anyone, pretending to look good all the time. A couple years ago, I gave a talk at Harvard College, and the head of the counseling center was there. And he revealed something that was so eye-opening to me. He said that the number one predictor of a college student doing well in college was not their GPA, not their socioeconomic status, not which major they took, but anyone want to guess? But they had at least one friend that they could speak to truly openly about what was on their minds. Knowledge Chachaber, I think, says Mishnah Knowledge, right? Okay, so getting back to my question. So you have patients at the beginning of the pandemic. Some of them did really well, some of them did not do well with levels of anxiety. So if you've been through therapy for anxiety, I mean, certainly if you've been through evidence-based therapy for anxiety, I should say, you know a couple of things. One, uncertainty is unavoidable. You cannot eliminate uncertainty. That is a core principle that is emphasized in cognitive behavior therapy. Two, you know it's unrealistic to always feel good. You are going to have emotional fluctuations. If you have anxiety, as they say, boker tov, right? You're a human being. Three, it's impossible to look good all the time. And if you have those perspectives and the skills which are brought out from that, then actually anxiety is not that bad. It's just part of the human condition. It's nothing to get upset about. It's a bad day, or maybe a bad week or a month, or maybe longer, but I'm going to deal with it, and I'm going to get ahead of it, and I'm going to talk about it with my friends and get the help I need, as opposed to it being something that you really cannot tolerate. That's when it gets intolerable. But the people who didn't have therapy before March 2020, they were sitting ducks, because all of a sudden, uncertainty goes through the roof. We don't know what's going to happen next. They're trying to do everything they can to reduce their anxiety, to reduce their feelings. They're trying to look good to their friends, especially with all the social media stuff going on and cameras. And all they could do was try to reduce the feelings as opposed to letting themselves experience anxiety and just letting it ride, which we'll get to soon. All of those strategies make anxiety worse, substantially worse. I would even go as far as to say something else, though, that not only is anxiety something that's just part of the human condition and benign, is what I'm saying. I've basically been saying it's benign. It actually could be a blessing. And I really mean that. I wrote an article about this, which was in Prevention Magazine in April 2020, called The Blessing of an Anxiety Disorder. It turned a lot of heads. And the upshot is that it was really the beginning for this book, Thriving with Anxiety. Because I'm realizing now that anxiety can teach you new things about yourself, deepen your relationship with other people, and enable us to not only be resilient, but actually to achieve our deepest dreams and to know that you're on the path of achieving those dreams. I've come to the conclusion over the last couple of years that anxiety is not a disease at all. Yes, it can become disordered when people don't deal with it, but if you have the right tools, I actually think anxiety can enhance your life. If you've been blessed with anxiety, and I mean it like that, you can unpack it, and by learning to deal with it, it can radically shift your relationship with yourself, with others, and frankly, spiritually as well. Now, that might sound a little crazy, but I'll give you some examples of this. When you really step back and look at anxiety from a broader perspective, anxiety is very related to fear. Fear is when people have an actual threat and your adrenaline kicks in and all of those bodily functions that I was speaking about before, your heart starts pumping, breathing starts, your pupils dilate to increase your field of vision so you can see things. Some people have tingling and numbness which is cool because your blood vessels are constricting to keep blood in case, God forbid, lose a limb. Muscle fibers get tense because you're powering yourself up. And all of those adaptive, healthy processes occur when a person has threat. That would be fear. Or if it's not a real threat, we call it anxiety. So a couple years ago, I'm leaving my office in New York. I step out onto the street. I'm checking my email as I'm stepping onto the street, which is not a good idea. And I see a bus coming towards me, probably 50 miles an hour. It was very late at night, and the guy was speeding. And, froze, completely panicked, and I decided you have the fight or flight response, right? Which one do you think I picked? Good idea, that's why I'm here. I decided to flee and darted out of the way. I made it. And if I had not been wired for a fear response, I wouldn't be here today. That is the same as anxiety. It's the same wiring as anxiety, and it's intended to protect you. It's a very helpful thing. In fact, there are certain people who do not have enough fear. It's very rare. In fact, most of them don't survive even a couple of months. Neonates, babies who are shortly after birth, are tested to see if they have a startle reflex, right? I don't know how they do it in Israel. Sometimes like a sound is emitted, like a little mini foghorn. Or sometimes the baby's picked up off the bed and just see if they have this startle reflex, the Moro reflex as it's called. Children who don't have that usually don't survive. That's a very sign of a severe neurological condition. Not having enough fear or anxiety is potentially life-threatening. The other thing, though, is that it can actually give you superhuman strength. How many people here have a license, a driver's license? Okay, you live in Modi'in, you probably have a license, right? You have a license. So, when you went to get your license, did they ask you whether you wear corrective lenses? Okay. Yes, is the answer. Did they ask you whether you had any medical conditions that could impair you from driving a car, such as epilepsy or seizures? Did they ask you whether you have panic attacks? No, they did not. Why? How do I know that? Because there isn't a single country in the world where they ask you whether you have panic attacks. So why is that? You would think that if you're panicking, you cannot drive a car, right? But that's actually not true. I'll tell you a story. One of my first patients I saw years ago, I'll call him John, he had these extremely strong panic attacks, and this was in Canada, so there's this thing called winter there. And it was not pretty, right? Driving 65 miles an hour or 110 kilometers an hour, what is that, in the left lane, starts to feel anxious, panic, and he's trying to get his car off of the highway. So he actually told me he was all the way in the left lane. He had to check his blind spot, go into the next lane, go to the next lane. There's a massive mound of snow. He had to wait another 100 meters or so, and safely go off to the side. And finally, so he comes to my office and he says, "I'm having these panic attacks. This is my experience in the car. I cannot drive. You can see I'm unsafe. What do I do?" So this is my first panic patient ever, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what to do, and frankly, you're making me anxious. But so I went to my supervisor, and he said, "Okay, let me ask you the following." He said, "I've been running this clinic for 10 years at the time. We've had 7,500 anxiety patients. Many of them have panic. How many of them have crashed their cars because of panic attacks?" I said, "I don't know." He said, 0.
Right.
0. Right. And in fact, if you look at the National Law Review, he pointed me to, what's the most common cause of auto accidents? Carelessness, inattention, driver inattention. People are checking their phones. It's not a lack of panic or a lack of being in the moment. It's a lack of attending to it. It's actually too little anxiety. I wish people were more anxious on the roads. So in my next session with John, I shared with him that if you have an adrenaline surge while you're driving, that's great. And he said, "Would you come in the car with me on a busy winter highway while I'm having a panic attack?" I said, "I'd prefer to be with you than with anybody else." And I did. I was really nervous. But at the end of the day, I knew that it was going to be fine because he was having an adrenaline surge Firstly, if you thought about it, the first story he told me was crazy. He's having a panic attack, and he manages to pull these crazy maneuvers between cars at 110 kilometers an hour in the dead of winter with snowbanks on the side. He's Mario Andretti. I mean, he can drive anything. He's the best driver out there. I prefer to be with an anxious driver, and I've done this many times with other drivers since. If someone's panicking in the car, I put my legs up, I'm reading a magazine, I am totally calm. I know they're not going to crash. They have more in it.
I drove on black ice in Texas. On black ice in Texas, I was going crazy. I slowed down the car. I kept going straight, and the car kept falling off back and forth.
It's because you went crazy that if you were inattentive, then you would have been in trouble. If you have that adrenaline surge, that's what can keep you alive. So we see that like anxiety can save your life, literally, but it can also prime people for leadership and give them superhuman strength. Another thing is success and failure. I mentioned at the beginning how many successful people have anxiety. I don't know too many super successful people who don't have significant anxiety. Yes, it can cloud your judgment if it's too much on an ongoing basis, but part of the reason is anxiety, at the core of it, is anticipation of threat. I'm nervous about something is going to happen. So that makes me think, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? What if that happens? And if you harness it right, you can actually have a plan for each of those scenarios, which could potentially be very helpful. Now, if you're doing that times 100 and it stifles you, obviously that's too much. But the actual bit of anxiety that you have can definitely propel a person forward. There's no question. It's just a matter of harnessing it with the right tools to keep it in the right level. But you don't want zero. Zero is not going to be helpful. If you look at the secular world, Mark Twain, comedian Jim Carrey, pop star Selena Gomez, Bruce Springsteen, I don't know if you know this, he's been hospitalized multiple times for anxiety. At the hospital where I work in Boston, McLean Hospital, just got an award actually today for number 1 in psychiatry by U.S. News and World Report. There are a lot of famous people that we see on a regular basis. Almost, I shouldn't say almost all of them, many of whom have very significant anxiety. And one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that this isn't news anymore. Right? A lot of people with notoriety have spoken out about their concerns. Okay, so I want to give like a practical strategy here. And I can see a lot of hands were showing up before, so I hope you're writing down your questions and comments, and we can have a conversation after this. But this is one of the practical strategies taken from chapter 3 of my new book, Thriving with Anxiety: 9 Tools to Make Your Anxiety Work for You, which is called Transcend Your Anxiety. Transcend your anxiety. Okay, the basic idea is like this. Anxiety can provide us, with opportunities to push beyond our perceived limits and to develop an inner strength that we never knew we had. So how many people here have heard of exposure therapy? 1, 2, not too many. Really, not too many. Only about 10%. Rabbi? Not? Rabbi said? No. Wow, okay, great. We're gonna learn about exposure therapy. This is gonna be fun. Okay, in a nutshell, exposure therapy helps people to overcome their anxiety by facing their fear head on. So if you're afraid of spiders, yes, I have people on my phone that I can call who come to the office with a case of spiders. Snakes, it's the same guy, usually. They have snakes. Typically. Okay, what about people who have obsessive compulsive disorder and they're really concerned about germs? So New York City subway is like heaven. Perfect place. Okay, people with social anxiety, they're nervous to speak in public. Anyone want to try? Really, we'll have them give an impromptu talk in front of an audience. Now, obviously, people start slow and then gradually, over time, build up. So if people are afraid of driving, they might start simply by turning on the engine in an empty parking lot. It's America, we gotta start really basic, right? But you might move up to basic maneuvers on side streets, and then eventually you're like, sailing down the Trans-Canada Freeway. But for whatever it is that you're doing, with people with OCD, it gets kind of gross at the end, often. Let's just say toilets are involved often. I wouldn't have anybody do something that I wouldn't do myself, but it's probably stuff you wouldn't want to do. It definitely gets uncomfortable. You have to be willing to experience uncomfortable feelings in exposure therapy. That's definitely a part of it. But the more somebody practices, the more their fears go down. It's an amazing thing. But another thing occurs, which is that when people go through this process, they typically, not always, but typically become more resilient to face other stressors in their lives that have nothing to do with their anxiety. They're building up their mental muscles. Now, I want to be clear. In some cases, exposure therapy is not enough. That's why my book has 9 tools, not just one. But I do think it's a first-line treatment. That's going to be my first card to play with people who have anxiety. So, because it's a very, very valuable aspect of it. Okay, I'll give you a case example of how this works. And yeah, I'll tell you about a case that came my way. We'll call this patient Rebecca. She was a 27-year-old woman. She had very significant hypochondriasis. Anyone know what hypochondriasis is? A hypochondriac. So it's a type of OCD, of obsessive compulsive disorder, where the obsession is that they have something medically wrong with them. And the compulsion that they do is usually checking either the symptoms, doing body scans. The WebMD is like their favorite, right? You can bookmark that way too much. Going to multiple doctors to check out what's wrong. Those are compulsive behaviors, which they're using, pardon me, to try to get their anxiety to come down, and it only makes it worse. That's part of the trying to contain, constrain, reduce your anxiety, as opposed to letting it go and saying, hey, I really might get sick here, and being okay with it. So this young woman was single and Orthodox and from Brooklyn, and she was very obsessed with the fear that she might have an aneurysm. So she had no indications that she actually might truly have an aneurysm, but she was really obsessed with this, and she could not shake this little bug in her head out, no matter how hard she tried. So, of course, she had been to neurologists, she had had multiple MRIs, I had seen them, she was fine. The one thing I knew about her brain is that she did not have an aneurysm, very clearly. But she couldn't stand it, and I'll tell you what happened to her. What she really didn't want to happen was to have high stress, and then for her blood vessels to constrict, and then for the aneurysm to burst, and for her to die. You can understand why that would be something she would not want to occur. But because of this, she started to avoid basic things in life. Like she wouldn't leave her house, except to go to work. Because the last time, years ago, that she was in a supermarket, she started to feel really panicky, started to feel anxious, thought that her brain was going to explode, and then she ran out, right, dropping her eggs on the floor. Big mess. So one day she was reading this magazine article. There was a character who had an aneurysm and died, and she's like, I cannot take this anymore, and she finally came in. So the first thing I did was I said, I'd like to see your MRI. I just want to make sure that everything's okay here, just in case. And she definitely was fine. I then told her about exposure therapy, and I said, we are going to get you to have your blood pressure raised and risk the possibility of you having this aneurysm burst. So she said, what else are we going to do? I'm like, we're going to read stories about aneurysms. You're going to read you're going to watch videos about brains and brain surgery even, and give her all these situations that might, that would make her feel a lot more anxious, even though they weren't really actually having a real effect. And her response was very simple. What did she say? There's no way I'm going to do that. And she left my office. So before she did, I said to her, listen, the decision is yours. I respect whatever you're going to do. I really think if you do not do this, you will be plagued by this fear for the rest of your life. So she took 2 weeks to think about it, which was very responsible of her. And then she called my office, and she said, I'm ready. So I said, great, say the word aneurysm. She couldn't. Say the first 3 letters. So that was the first session, just to say the word aneurysm. All 4 syllables. And over time, we worked up to, actually I pushed people pretty quickly, as you might guess. Reading stories about people who died from aneurysms, very unpleasant to read about, going to the gym, getting her heart rate up to 190 beats a minute. She hated me. Rebecca was ready to kill me. And then eventually I worked her up to facing her greatest fear, dying of an aneurysm. I'm kidding. I didn't kill her. But she didn't want to, what she specifically didn't want was to die alone and end up in a city morgue, unidentified. I understand, that wouldn't be fun. So what we did was kind of creative on my part. I was pretty proud of this one. We flew her to a different city on her own. She did not use a credit card, she only brought cash. She did not use her family, and she did not tell her family, and she left her cell phone at home. So if she were to die that night, like, she's gonna end up in the Philadelphia morgue in some city, and like they're gonna have to extract it from some record, like dental records or something like that. And she was paralyzed with fear. It was really not fun. I coached her through it though, and she did it. She stayed over. I didn't even know where she ended up until afterwards, which was pretty amazing. And she died. No, I'm kidding. What did happen though was she was no longer limited by her fears. But then something crazy happened. Something really crazy happened. So 3 years later, I got a call from Rebecca. In the interim, by the way, she had gotten married. She had gotten married. I mean, if you can overcome the fear of aneurysms, then marriage, it's also scary, but probably a little less scary. Not for everyone, not with everyone. That's another talk. So I got a call from her several years later. She had gotten married, and she told me the following. She said, I have good news and bad news. I'm like, okay, what's the good news? She said she's pregnant. B'Shah Tova, wonderful. What's the bad news? She said, they saw something in the ultrasounds of the baby's brain. I'm like, is this your OCD again? Can I speak to your husband? And he's like, no, this is real. I'm like, oh dear, what do I do now? So it was not an aneurysm, but it did mean that after the birth, this baby would have to go and have a very special surgery. And Rebecca's telling me about this, and she's totally calm. And I say, you don't sound nearly as anxious as I would be in your situation. What are you using to medicate yourself? Like, what's going on here? And she said, no, that was one of my questions, is that I'm feeling kind of uncomfortable about this, and I'm not sure whether I should go back into therapy, whether I should try medications or anything. And I'm like, Rebecca, I know you're uncomfortable, but this is normal given your situation. You're on the low end of the spectrum of how tense any new mom would be with this kind of situation. This is crazy. And I said, how are you doing this? She said, I'm just drawing on everything you taught me. I'm facing my fear, I'm tolerating uncertainty, I'm not hiding it. I'm letting my symptoms occur, I'm facing them, I'm thinking about the possibility of what might really happen here. And I said to her, like, you're doing great. You're doing great. I think, in fact, if anything, you have a thing to teach me about anxiety, because I could never handle this the way you are. So the baby was delivered. There was a critical surgery, and fine, survived. I think the greatest miracle of the story, though, wasn't the baby. It was the fact that she handled the situation so amazingly. And the fact that she had gone through that anxiety, she even said this to me, that the fact that she had experienced anxiety in the first place was a tremendous blessing, because it gave her the opportunity to transcend it. And that made her so strong to be able to be resilient and handle that next difficulty in her life. What was really interesting, though, is that she didn't develop anything new. She had that inner strength all along. She just needed to uncover it, and her anxiety was the impetus for her to do so. Okay, so a couple final points. Firstly, I mentioned before, the name of my program in the United States is called Center for Anxiety. So at the beginning when I started it, a lot of people were saying, a lot of my colleagues were puzzled, and they're like, why don't you call it the Center for Anxiety Relief, or Center for Anxiety Treatment, or something? So now you know why. Because you can't help people to deal with anxiety by making them less anxious. That's not the right direction. If you do that, it's actually counterproductive. You have to learn to make it your friend. Center for Anxiety was the perfect name, because the goal is to learn to thrive with your anxiety and actually to have it, not to get rid of it. Okay, so we are at a shul, so I think it's only appropriate to highlight that this approach to anxiety really comes from the Torah education that I've had. And with this, I'm going to conclude and take your questions. If you look through Tanakh, it's an amazing thing. There's so many examples of leaders across Jewish history who struggled and had emotional distress. All of the Avos, Imahos, Moshe Rabbeinu, David HaMelech, look at like all the Ushpizim, anybody who comes to your sukkah. The greatest people in Jewish history, they've all had very significant struggles. And those were very clear. They're recorded explicitly. You know, we just went through Tisha B'Av last week, and I was in Yerushalayim, and I went to the Kotel, and you have people sitting, lying on the ground, barefoot, crying, and they're truly sad. We are truly sad. It's amazing. The Torah is not afraid of strong emotions. There's nothing wrong with having intense emotions. And the reason why, I think, is because B'Tselem Elokem Baras Adam. If you know that you're created in God's image, okay, so you have intense emotions. But it doesn't mean I'm crazy. It doesn't mean something's wrong with me. It just means that this is part of the package. There's no expectation in Torah that your feelings, I don't know, maybe your even behaviors potentially are perfect all the time. There is an expectation that we try our best, and we grow, and we move forward from the place that we're at. Yes, of course. But it's such a radically different perspective than modern psychiatry, which assigns disordered labels and